other than the iPad 10.2 inch, aka the iPad 7th generation, and see how this thing holds up in 2021. Now, first of all, this iPad is not even that old. It's not even 2 years old at this point, so it's completely still worth it. But I will tell you, since we've gotten the iPad 8th generation and a couple of other iPads since then, it may make sense to go and upgrade to one of those iPads or even buy one of those used, more so than buying one of these brand new or, any other case like that. Now, I will go ahead and leave this one link down below and some other iPads that I'd probably recommend throughout this year. You can get them from the description below and help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the front of this iPad, it did have that kind of newer 10.2 inch panel on the front. Now, it wasn't like a crazy, tremendous upgrade from the previous one, the 6th generation, but it was a little bit of a, size increase, which was nice. And I really did like that. They also decreased a little bit of bezel around the whole entire panel. So I think that was another big improvement. Now, you do have that front facing camera on the front as well, and you still have that home button. Now, again, it's kind of in this day and age where, we've just gotten the iPad Air 4 that just, removed its bezel. At some point, either the iPad 9 or 10th generation is going to remove the bezel around it too at some point, but I really don't think it's going to happen right now. So you're still going to be fine in terms of the front of this iPad. So I don't think it's really that big of a deal. And to be honest, the gestures and everything that we still have on those other iPads are still pretty much the same on this iPad as well. So it's really not that big of a deal here. So in terms of the iPad on the front, thumbs up for me. It's really not that big of a deal. The resolution is also super high on this panel. Now, you do have the lightning port on the bottom, which is great. Headphone jack as well. But on top of that, the aluminum back on this thing, I can tell you, and I've told you time and time again, this back on this device is so good. It just feels so premium. Pretty much every single iPad I've ever had was extremely good. I've never really had like a complaint for these iPads, to be completely honest. There were some issues here and there, to be honest, but I think for the most part, this iPad feels extremely good in the hand. It feels extremely premium. And whenever I hold this iPad and I hold another iPad, I really don't see there being that big of a difference, if I'm being completely honest. So in terms of that, and in terms of the front, the feeling, the premiumness, everything, it gets a thumbs up for me for sure. I think this is a solid build quality 100%. Now, moving on to the camera side of things, this iPad, like I mentioned, has that single 8 megapixel sensor on the back, and I really do think it's a pretty good camera setup. I don't think it's a bad camera at all, and I think, as I mentioned time and time again, this is one of those areas where these iPads just kill it in for a, iPad's sake. Now, this iPad, for it not being the greatest, latest and greatest iPad, I think it's totally okay and justifiable because it's not necessarily like the most expensive iPad you can buy. So for it only having an 8 megapixel sensor for the price tag, I think it's okay, especially if you're doing things like Google Meets calls or Zoom calls or anything like that. I think you're going to be totally okay for that standpoint. You also have that 1.2 megapixel front facing camera, and you can do 720p videos on that specific lens as well. Now, the front camera may be the one area where you're going to have more complaints at. I think the back camera is actually pretty okay for the most part, but as I mentioned, that front camera is that one area where some people may actually want a little bit more from their device. There's no 4K on this camera, which again is one of those areas that could have been improved on, but there's nothing we can do about it. And quite possibly, there's no 1080p on the front as well. And as I mentioned, that is one of those areas that I, wish it was just a little bit better in. There's nothing we can do about it at that point, but I think in terms of the overall camera standpoint, that's pretty much how I would kind of sum up this specific iPad. So in terms of that pretty much covers it up. Now, moving on to, I think, again, two of the best things about this iPad, the battery life and the software. Now, the software, it started off with iPadOS 13. Right now, it is upgradable to iPadOS 14, the latest version, and it's probably going to be getting iPadOS 15, as most of us know. Now, I don't know how, long this thing's going to last in terms of that. It could potentially get iPadOS 16, and I really hope it does, because if this thing just came out in 2019, I hope it lasts as long as possible. Now, the reason why it's a little bit iffy is because this thing has pretty much the same chipset as that, iPhone 7, the Apple A10 Fusion, and that's been out for a while. So I'm not 100% too sure what's going to happen in terms of this iPad Sense, but I really do hope Apple goes ahead and updates this thing for as long as possible, and maybe at the earliest iPadOS 15, but I think it would probably go even beyond iPadOS 15. I think it's going around like 16 or 17, hopefully. But again, we don't know. But it's still getting software updates for the time being, which that in and of itself gets a thumbs up for me for sure. But it also has that 8,827 mAh battery inside of it. And as I've mentioned before, and I've said this time and time again, iPads have some of the best battery lives on any device out there. and this is no exception. Having that type of battery life on this device just makes this thing that much better of a deal. And as I mentioned before, I mentioned this time and time again, having that type of battery life is going to future-proof yourself like crazy. And I've been in so many situations where sometimes my battery life won't last as long, or there's been issues or whatever, but almost every single time I've used an iPad, I've never complained about the battery life. I've complained about a lot of other things. The battery life tends to be not one of those issues I complain about. So that really pretty much covers up two of the main things that I love about this iPad. Again, not like the craziest best features ever, but I'm glad for the price tag that it was and it is now. It's still going to use software support, and the battery life is pretty good too. So in terms of that covers that specific section up. Now moving on and ending it off with the performance. As I mentioned before, this iPad has that Apple A10 Fusion chip inside of it with 3 gigabytes of RAM. Now, I've mentioned this time and time again, and I'll just continue saying it. iPads, iPhones, you don't need a ton of RAM to go ahead and keep things going. And this iPad, again, is one of those iPads that handles, whatever it has inside of it, it handles it extremely well. Now, first of all, performance on this iPad is really good. It's very smooth, and it is predictable. Now, I do kind of seeing it glitch up just a little bit. It's not really a tremendously crazy deal. I wish it was a little bit better here and there in terms of the animation speeds and all that, but it's still extremely smooth, and I really don't have too many complaints when it comes down to the performance section in terms of that. Now, if you're trying to do like super heavy intensive games and stuff like that, one of my bigger problems with the Apple A10 Fusion chip was pretty much like super intensive gaming. The iPhones tend to get really hot. This iPad is one of those iPads that would get warmed up a little bit if you, kind of push it to the limit. So that's another kind of minor thing to keep in mind. Again, maybe not a major deal for a lot of people, but it is one of those things that kind of keep in mind at the end of the day. So I think in terms of that standpoint, this iPad does kind of kill it. I think it does a really good job in terms of the chipset that it has inside of it, and the RAM and everything. It's definitely not the best, performing iPad by any means, but I think if you're a student, if you're somebody who just kind of, wants to use an iPad and maybe take notes, maybe, write documents and all those different things, any cloud-based thing, in my opinion, that you're going to use, whether you're a professional or whatever the case is, I think you're going to be getting a really good performing tablet from this thing. But I think on the other side as well, if you're somebody who's doing some more intensive stuff, I think these iPads can really get you super far as well. The only problem is if you're doing like very crazy video editing, sometimes it can get a little bit of an issue, but I've edited videos on iPads before. I know a lot of people who, edit full time on these type of iPads, and they, they just give high praise to these things. So I think that's a really awesome thing to keep in mind as well. So take it as you will, but that's pretty much how I would kind of sum up the performance in this specific case. So to kind of sum up this video and answer the question, should you go and buy an iPad 7th generation in 2021? Well, this is pretty much what I'm going to tell you. I think for sure this iPad is a killer iPad in so many different ways. I really don't think it's not like a bad performing iPad. It's not anything like that. There are just a few minor complaints in my opinion, but even those complaints are not even complaints. They're just like, there's just kind of like this thing that I may not like about it. One thing being no USB-C. I really do kind of like USB-C on iPads. That's why I love the iPad Pros. I wish this thing had it, but it's not that big of a deal. I wish this thing maybe had like 4K cameras on either one of them. I think that would have been really cool, but that's really not that big of a complaint. And those are really my main complaints. Other than that, the performance is pretty good still. The screen and the body and everything still feels extremely premium. I don't really care that it has the home button on the front. I think that's, doesn't really matter to me. The software on this thing is amazing. The ecosystem is amazing. The battery life is amazing. So other than that, I think this iPad is still completely worth it in that sense. Again, not perfect, but it extremely gets the job done for sure. So in terms of that pretty much covers it up. If you guys have any other questions, or if you want to pick these iPads up like I mentioned, links will be down in the description. You can get them from there and help support the channel at the same time. Hit the like button if you guys enjoyed the video, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count. So thank you so much if you guys can hit that. Also check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my other channels. More importantly, everything else. I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.